I was living in Callista, Parents Creek Road, Callista. I was with a company called Smith & Nephew. I started there when I was probably about 17, a pharmaceutical company. They were very, very good to me. And of course, by law, they had to keep my job open when I came back from Vietnam, and sure enough, they did. But because of Mum's background, I remember when I got a phone call from work and I came home and my little card, call-up card, was not destroyed, but Mum had a few words to say about it. Dad was pleased. I'm sure the local police, because us yahoos, the policeman in Olinda was probably happy. You know, one of his, hoons had gone off to do military service. Dad, of course, as we spoke before, had served in New Guinea, and his two brothers were there. The third brother, who was in the Air Force, never went past that line, so he could never get the gold card. And my grandfather, being a Gallipoli veteran, even though he only lasted 10 days at Gallipoli, he, of all things, Service Corps, carrying ammunition boxes to the front, he did a hernia. Not really good on your military record. So he was whipped off to one of the Greek islands and then later went to England, and he only joined the army because it was a chance of seeing his grandparents, because we, the Bristows, came to Australia in 1901, and this was his chance of going back to see his grandparents with the Australian government paying for it. He didn't know he'd end up in the Middle East, and he didn't know he'd end up at Gallipoli. But as I said, I just took it as the norm because those people before me volunteered. I didn't volunteer. I was called up because my birthday was on the 11th of July. When I was called up, I went in on the 8th of July 1970, and I couldn't work out why no one had the same birthday as me. You would expect it, and it wasn't until I joined this club in 2014 that I found out someone was in not the same platoon, the same birthday, but the intake before me. I was in the third intake of 1970. He was in the second intake, and then after talking to Mother and her activities, including a certain letter that she sent off to a certain person of power in Canberra, threatening if anything happened to me, it would happen to him. You can see why the army kept I didn't know this, and I kept getting these funny questions asked all the time when I'm pucker. And I think because of that, it was still difficult because I'd never been away from home, and Puckapunyal was really cold in July. But, they sort of asked questions and things were a little bit easier for me because I think they were worrying about a certain mother. Everybody has an option. Yeah. No, not the regular army, a volunteer to go to Vietnam. Right. Everybody says you're called up and you're sent to Vietnam. You're not. I think it was 40, I'm doing a talk next week, the Historical Society in Sherbrooke, so I've had to research it. 40,000 national servicemen were called up, and I think 13,000 or something like that went to Vietnam. And all through my time, I was asked, as you move through the system, do you wish to go to Vietnam? And if you said at any time, no, this is infantry, I can't talk for the others, because we had 9 battalions, and in 1970, there was talk about raising the 10th battalion, because as we all know, the first 3 battalions, 1, 2 and 3, were basically raised after the Second World War with what people wanted to stay in the army. And those 3 battalions were involved in Korea. But of course, when Mr. Menzies committed us, we had the Australian Vietnam training team, and they'd been there since '62, but the Australian Army, the infantry, I think the 5th and the 6th battalions in 66, 65, 66 were the first two. Then they started to build up because of national service coming in every 3 months. More troops were coming into the system because I remember at the time when I had said I would go to Vietnam, they indicated if I didn't want to go to Vietnam, it's all right because the 5th and the 6th battalion were in Malaya. The 3rd and the 4th were in Vietnam in 1970, or 70, 71. So if I didn't want to go to Vietnam and I wanted an overseas posting, I could have gone to Penang, or I don't think it's Butterworth. I think Butterworth is where the planes are. Right. But I had a choice of going to those, and I said, no, I'll go to Vietnam. And, you know, I did. But as soon as I left Puckapunyal, after 10 weeks, because my first choice was armour, and little did I know at the time, you know, you needed 7 out of 10 recruits to go into infantry. And I happened to say, look, I don't mind carrying the M60 machine gun. Silly me. So I said, look, gunner, second choice, rifleman, third choice. So automatically I got infantry. I did 10 weeks at Singleton, which is Muswellbrook and up that way to do infantry training. There I met up with people. Next to Singleton, where you do the infantry training, there was another recruit area, and people from Queensland and Northern Territory. It was a much smaller one, not like Puckapunyal, because Kapooka, I think, was where the regs went through, as we called them. And I met people there that had come from the northern states, and you're sort of infantry blokes, there's something about infantry. We're totally different. You know, I don't know what it is, whether it's in our training, but we're like a band of brothers. Having spent time in engineers with the reserves after the war, they're terrific, but it's just different, you know. This is true. When I got called up, strange things were happening to me. People were talking to me at Puckapunyal. I didn't know why they were talking to me about certain things, not knowing what Mum had been up to, especially the little bit about threatening the Prime Minister. Tends to go down really bad. Anyway, that is why I should have been called up in the second intake in 1970, not the third intake, because when I met Trevor here, and we were talking about things, hang on, how comes your birthday and you went then? It's because of Mum's anti-war feelings and the people that she was with. That was funny, and that's why people spoke to me, and I said, no, I want to stay. And after I said, I'm quite happy if you can do 10 weeks at Pucka. That was all right. I went straight to Singleton. Straight after Singleton, I came back and did 2 weeks. I had to go and do 2 weeks at Canungra. Now, when we came back from Canungra, because no one was sending us anywhere, all we did was play volleyball and play cards. The occult came into it. We had everybody's reading books on Westerns, and then then we had our Ouija board. This is not good, is it? And during the sessions, and this is true, in the huts were very old Second World War huts, and I don't know if you've ever been to Ingleburn, where the draft platoon was. You had the old Hume Highway passing through it, Picton's down the road, Liverpool's up there. So of a morning, you'd have to cross the road to have your lunch or your breakfast over there. But of a night time, during that time, I saw where eagles dare 14 times at 20 cents a time at the filling time. But we'd have these sessions with the occult. Now, this is true. Some clowns said, am I going to Vietnam? Bloody board went yes. Someone else said, am I going? It went no. This is 32 people in the draft platoon, and it didn't make a mistake. Those who said they were going to Vietnam, the board was spot on. I had told my sister, and I think it got a little bit out of hand at Callista. The typewriter started moving by itself at night time, so everybody stopped everything. I can only remember two people's names in the entire time. Corporal McClure, he was my section commander, section corporal, and acting sergeant, corporal he was at the time, Sergeant Dundee. Isn't it amazing? They're the only two that I could ever remember in the whole 18 months, but he was made official sergeant during our time up there. But each one of those representatives, whether it be my section leader or another section leader, all came from different corps, you know, infantry, artillery, engineers, and each one of a night time would point out the good points and the bad points of their corps. And my two corporals, which then made sergeant, were both Vietnam veterans. And, you know, but this is like in early 1970, or, you know, July 1970. It took me 1 year, 1 week and 1 day from the day I went into Puckapunyal is today that I landed in I think it's Tan San Sut, let's say Saigon Airport, but it was amazing. But I knew what it was all about. Dad had pointed out his experiences in New Guinea, and after he came back from New Guinea, my grandfather, being the first of his grandchildren to actually be called up into the armed forces, he had a lot of input. This is my paternal grandparents. He had a lot to say, and my grandmother, having had 4 sons involved in the Second World War, she put her dollars worth in. But I think they were proud. But you're young, you're 21, you don't think of the consequences of you're going to see. I'll be honest with you, I only ever saw one person get killed. Didn't know him from a bar of soap, but I often dream about it. But look, I didn't really think about it because I was young, you know, and I was extremely bitter when I came back from Vietnam. I went with Qantas. Yeah. I had never flown in my life with airport planes because I was a country boy, a real bumpkin, you know, quite naive and everything. And when I did my Singleton training, after 5 weeks, we had the opportunity of being put in buses, taken to Sydney Airport, and they flew us to Melbourne. Because I had an FB Holden and I'd taken that up to Singleton from Puckapunyal. And, you know, when you get to like 50 miles an hour, rattle. So I took the option of coming back by plane. We had to pay for the plane. It was TAA or ANA, Ansett ANA, and I always preferred TAA to see the parents. But I thought a 727, you know, with the motors at the back and one in the tail area, you know, connected where the fin goes up. I thought, well, gee, that's big. But when I arrived at Saigon, I walked out Pan Am 747, white with blue Pan Am on it. And I'm thinking, how in the bloody hell would that fly? It was huge. But I, you know, we all looked at it. When we were flying, we started off in Sydney with the 707, stopped in Townsville to pick up people. It stopped in Darwin to pick up people. And then it landed in Singapore to get us breakfast. Scrambled eggs. There's a fancy me remembering that 50 years ago. Scrambled eggs and something, and it was extremely hot. We then waited for the time to refuel the flight, because it was definitely a Qantas flight, because it had air hostesses on board and we were talking to them. When it landed in Saigon, I'm going to call it Saigon because Tan San Sut, we had never seen Americans, you know, other than on TV. Then we got in an aircraft I didn't even know existed. It was called a Fairchild Provider. I didn't even know, because I love aircraft, I didn't even know it existed. It was, we call them two turners and two burners. It had small jets. And what was novel about them, the intake, you couldn't see it was a jet until it took off. The little door seemed to open, and then you could see where the air goes through and burnt and everything. That flew us to Nui Dat. And Nui Dat, this is as a private, a Mortimer, this is how I saw it. It was like two airfields, a large hospital complex that was surrounded by barbed wire, and I would like to think that was to keep the nurses in, because they were a frisky lot, I'm told. I don't know. But it seemed to be like a big wagon wheel. I know it sounds stupid, but to take, probably officers would disagree, but to me, at the time looking down on it, the Vietnamese would have had to take in each, it's like dividing a cake up, a pie, a tart, you know, and each part seemed to be fortified. So you had barbed wire between you and the next lot, as well as barbed wire facing out. And when I landed, I had no idea where everything were. And next thing I knew, I was at the 1st Reinforcement Unit. And that's where I spent 3 to 4 weeks acclimatising. During that time, I think it was like a company strength, we would go out and do ambushes. When I first arrived there, I did 3 to 4 weeks with the 1st Reinforcement Unit to acclimatise. And you know when you acclimatise, when the humidity is in the 90s and you get up and say, gee, it's a cool day today. And during that time with the unit, they take you out to do exercises in the jungle, 3 and 4 and 5 days initially, but then it got a little bit longer. You know, this volunteering bit, it's not good. One day they called me up. You know, with certain weapons, some people have a knack and some people don't. And there's a thing called an M79 grenade launcher. You don't think of like the Russian bazooka one they call a grenade launcher. It's a 40mm, looks like a big shotgun. And I had a knack with that. And they asked for someone to carry it. And they said, you will also be carrying a 9mm Browning pistol. And I thought, oh, less to clean. Not, you can't lose it. When I got to the end of the line, he said, I'm terribly sorry, Bristow, but we've run out of pistols. So you'll have to carry an M16 as well as the M79. I said, all right, then I'll try it. And because of all the explosives that I was carrying on my chest, they said, right, you don't have to carry link for the machine gun. You know what link is, don't you? No. It's the belt. Okay. They call it link. And most soldiers carried 100 rounds linked together because you can't expect the machine gunner or the 2 people with the machine gunner to carry extra rounds. So every soldier carried at least 200 rounds. Anyway, because I had this thing like a fisherman's thing, and you had the grenade ones, I think I carried 12 here, and I had 2, I hadn't seen a Bren gun in my life, but I had 2 Bren gun pouches which carried, I think, 24 illumination rounds. And at the very top, which I'd never seen in Australia, buckshot, which I'm told everybody pointed out, you do not point a grenade launcher at anybody less than 40 metres from you, because it will not detonate. It takes that time to arm itself. And people had threatened, well, you know, if you do that, if you hit a person and it doesn't go off, they're not going to put him in the helicopter to bring him back. I didn't ask any more questions. So I would imagine someone would have been at the end and helped him. I didn't ask. I have no idea what they would have done, but I'm sure if it had got to that, I would have thrown the weapon at him and ran that way. The first one that I ever went out on, I don't know if you want to know this, but the first time I ever went out, boy, was it gung-ho. You look out and there's helicopters to the right, to the left, behind you, in front of you. And then darting between them was the, I had never seen them in the Australian Armed Forces, or RAF or Army, were the gunships, Cobras, I think, something like that. Narrow, I think they were called Cobras, and rockets and guns, and they were shooting up everything. We landed. As the helicopters landed, everybody, some went to the side. No one ever went to the back because the pilots couldn't see at the back, so you went out and sort of formed almost a semicircle. Then he lifted off, and your corporal then directed you to, and you made the perimeter bigger and bigger and bigger until the last landed. Then we formed an extremely long line. From what I remember, it was like 15 paces between you and the person in front, and it rained all the time, and you're always wet, but it was humid. And my biggest worry was losing sight of the person in front of you, and when they stopped, you know, you'd get, how we communicated was hitting our butt of our weapon to get someone's attention in front of you or behind you. But when everybody stopped, you're frantic thinking, where is he? You know, because everything's green, except when the sunlight comes through the trees, you sort of yellow beams of light coming down. And it was really unreal. I didn't know how to take it all, but I didn't want to let the grandparent, or, you know, grandfather and dad down, and I was always worried, how would I react when I was fired on? As it turned out later, I wasn't too worried, you know, but at the time I'm thinking, oh, I hope I don't run. You know, it sounds really bad, doesn't it? You know, freeze. We got lost, and for 4 days, we were using at the time American ration packs, which is the Australian one is a 1-day ration pack. The American ones were 1 meal. So you had to be resupplied because you could only carry so much because you were carrying ammunition. And in my case, because I had all this up here, I didn't have to carry, I think it was the M26 fragmentation grenades, because they figured I had enough on me, but I had to carry 2 smoke grenades, which I had attached somewhere. And because, as I said, I had the M16, I was carrying a bandolier of 5 magazines. I had no room in my webbing, so I carried the M16 rounds in my pockets, because we had pockets on the side. And because I was superstitious, I only put 19 rounds in each magazine. But because I only carried 19, and it wasn't my weapon to worry about when I came back to Australia, I hand-loaded my own magazines myself, and I used tracer. Do you know what tracer is? Can you imagine it? 8 magazines, 19 rounds. I created Star Wars before the movie came out. And gee, it looked good of a night time, but I did that, and every couple of days, you sort of, when we went out to do an ambush, you always had the straight line about 100 metres, 200 metres from the path, the track, and the others were forming like a triangle, and every time we go, we'd move around. You know, if you were on this flank, you'd be in the front next time. And I never knew what was out there, because I never went out there, and I didn't want to go out there. But my task was to fire illumination rounds in the air. There had to be 7 rounds at any given time. And how the contact was initiated, in front of us was, you know what a claymore mine is? Well, they had them all the way along, like 100 metres or whatever. And it could be command detonated this end or this end. So if the people were coming this way, that person, when the first person came to him, he fired the claymores, or if it came the other way, he fired the claymores. So that way you get everybody. And as soon as the claymores went off, I was asleep, by the way, because I was tired. You didn't need to stay awake, but I was in the front row. And I started firing these flares. Couldn't see it. My night vision was gone. Thank goodness I had tracer. And a couple of times I got spoken to harshly. Everybody's firing straight forward. I'm doing this. That up, pick up the magazine, 19 rounds, weapon down, another flare up. As the first one hit the ground, the 8th had to be up, and so on, you know, until the whole 24 had gone and all my ammunition was gone. But I always knew it was me because everybody else was firing in a straight line. I always fired low, so you're seeing the rounds going off. So if we ever find a squeaky American, a squeaky Vietnamese, you know it's me. I had something to do with it. When you do your reinforcement wing, everybody is riflemen. Then the word got out. The 4th Battalion needed pioneers. The 3rd Battalion, 3 RAR, which was based in Woodside, were desperate for mortarmen because a lot of their troops at that stage, they sort of brought in 18 months. You drop back from 2 years to 18 months. And they were desperate for mortarmen. I was a qualified mortarman. There was 3 of us that I'd gone through Puckapunyal with, or 2. I met the 3rd one at, met him when I went to Singleton because he came from northern New South Wales. So then I automatically was a mortarman assigned to the 3rd Battalion, and seriously, I never fired a rifle round again. I did all my shooting with the reinforcement unit, and I must have fired hundreds of rounds. But when I got to the mortars, we were so short of personnel. Each mortar tube was supposed to have 3 men. We were so understaffed, we had to do with 2. And trying to prepare the mortars, because next thing you hear, you know, with being a mortarman, 90% of the time you do nothing. Then you have 10% full on. You do the fire mission, someone gets on the radio and says, we need 99 rounds downrange now. So you have to prepare 33 rounds like that. And I don't know if you've ever seen a mortar. You've got these increment bags, which are explode. You've got the main primary charge, that like a big shotgun without pellets. There's little holes, and the force goes, when it goes off, when it drops down the barrel, the explosion comes out the little holes, which detonates the little increment bags, which are full of gunpowder or whatever. And the increment bags control the range. So if you're going to shoot at 5 kilometres, you have the barrel as low as you can have, 10 increment bags. But if we could actually fire at 40 metres away, taking all the increment bags off, just the main charge if we're about to be overrun, which I was never overrun. And the barrel's almost vertical, you know, almost. You know, 2 of us are trying to prepare the rounds, and the last 3 rounds from each tube, and there was 3 tubes, were white phos. Oh, white phos was a nasty, nasty thing. It just burnt and burnt. I didn't like white phos. That's why I never carried a white phosphorus grenade at all. I thought they were not nice at all. But we fired this, we call them smoke, but anyway, so that was that. When I was with mortars, you know how we're talking about you never know how you react? Well, one day, waiting for fire missions, I was asleep on a stretcher on the outside of the perimeter of the vehicle. I should have been on the inside, but I was on the outside. And all of a sudden, there was this one hell of an explosion. And it's amazing what your army training kicks in. The stretcher was this far off the ground, but the time I rolled off the stretcher with my SLR, because it was always next to me, and having never fired it with the mortars, I had the weapon cocked, instant, and by the time I hit the ground, it was ready to fire. And it was red, and I'm looking out there. And from then on, I never worried that I would panic under fire. I was out for about, I think the longest was 2 weeks, or 10 days. But during that, this strange event happened. We were lost, which I've mentioned before. We didn't know where we were. Well, we knew we were in Vietnam. Nui Dat must have known roughly we were in Phuoc Tuy province. It sounds rude, doesn't it? But that was the name of it. So we all sat around, and the young lieutenant was on the radio via his SIG. He spoke to one of the batteries. I think it was the 14th, but don't quote me. They knew where they were going to put their shots. And boy, did us soldiers worry about it. You know, whatever the distance is, a long way away, you'd hear a tiny, tiny little boom, and the next minute, explosions over there. We almost wet our pants. But because of jungle, you can't see the explosion, you hear it. And we're always thinking, how in the hell did they know where to put the first round? But I wasn't privy to that information. I would like to think the lieutenant said, we're not standing next to a creek, could you shoot it at a creek? And that the NCOs and the platoon sergeant and the officer were doing back bearings with the compass, because the army back there would have said we've landed it in this grid square. By doing a back bearing, you just, you get a bearing of say 200, you just reverse it so 100 degrees back on that line. This happened 3 times, and each time you hear this, oh hell. But we weren't lost after that, after we got the triangulation. I got on the helicopter, which was a Chinook, the big two. Yep. Got on, and it was American. And it was an African American. I won't say Negro, African American. And he said, sit. And I know all the officer ranks. I do have problems with the senior sergeants, because they have stripes up this way, then they have things underneath, then they have emblems. And he said, sit. And he was, he wasn't wearing a shirt, he was wearing a flak vest. We should have had flak vests. And he had a revolver. Normally you see them with the .45 Colt, the Americans that I'd seen. He had the revolver, well, like a 6-shooter, like Wyatt Earp, tied down. And on this side, it was a cross between a pocket knife and a machete on the other side. And if he'd said to me, jump, I would have jumped from the helicopter. He had me frightened, hell. And I was sitting there all by myself. They took me to the fire support base. That mortar platoon was commanded by a lieutenant. The armoured personnel carriers had the sergeant. I never saw the sergeant until the end of the war. I was out there a day, and I spent the night in something that was made out of corrugated iron and a hole, and what do you call it, sandbags around it, individual person's hole. And then he said, right, we're going back to Nui Dat. I just left Nui Dat. So we went back, or the armoured personnel came out, and we swapped over. And this is the only, I don't know how it happened, but when I got there, he said, right, we're going in R&I. Well, I think it's R&I. Leave in Vung Tau. Yeah, you've got to be there. Whatever. Yeah. And I'd only been in Vietnam less than a month. And the annoying thing is, when I knew I was going out, I went and bought a 35mm Yashica, because I didn't take it out with me because I had a little Instamatic one, because it took a lot of photos until it got wet. And I just spent my money, $99 worth, buying this camera. So, of course, when I'm told I'm going down to the Peter Badco Club at Vung Tau, everybody's lending me money because we all went to the different bars. I won't say what we got up to there, but the one that I went to was the Peacock, and there was a lovely young lady there. She decided to look after me. Her name was May Lee or something. So I went out there. The Peter Badco Club was swimming pool, accommodation block, eating block. When I went back in 2001 on the 30th anniversary, the only thing left now, the Peter Badco Club, is a swimming pool that's slimy and there's ducks living in it, amongst hotels, because when I went back, 9/11 had just taken place and all the Americans were concerned about going anywhere out of America. So it was only Australians, New Zealanders and French went there, and were we spoilt, you know, like my mate and myself who'd never been in the army. He, you know, two of us at the one table with about 5 waiters, because they had to keep the waiters employed, but, you know, but I was astounded that I went on leave and I'd only been in Vietnam. People were there 6, 7 months, never went down to Vung Tau. It's as if someone was guiding me. You know, with the funny little story later. But it was really good. We played cards. We had the movies every night. You would take your rifle, your chair, and you'd go to the movies, and it's like going to a drive-in without a car. The photographer, oh, not the, you know, the operating the camera, or the whatever you like to call it, a projector. He was undercover. The rest of us were sitting in the rain. It was interesting. Mosquitoes were everywhere. The rain was everywhere. Have you ever seen a drawing of what the huts look like, what the tents look like? Yeah, I have, yeah. Yes, with the blast wall and all that. But you had to take your chair with you so you could watch the movie. And of course, we never notice it when you go to the cinema, but because there's always 2 projectors and they sort of stop one and start one. Right. Well, we had to wait for that reel to be wound back, then a new reel put on, and we were talking while this was going on, and a few times there were stand-tos when all the lights had to go out. And was it frustrating, because we were in a rubber plantation, and if you hit one bloody tree, you're going to hit the other, because whichever way you look, they're in lines. And when we had stand-tos, I never got into the foxhole because it had spiders in there and snakes. So I just sat down behind the rubber tree and waited for the lights to come back on, and then you went back to the movie. But I did that. But as I said, we once watched the 3rd Battalion play the reinforcement unit at football. Now, I'm a non-drinker, but that doesn't mean I would, you know, make it hard for my cobbers. I never took advantage of them. They would come up to me, because you're allowed to have 3 cans of beer per day. And they're not the soft drink size can, not the aluminium ones. They were the steel one that was bigger. And so you wouldn't carry beer into the bush with you. They sort of, you know, and the boys said to me, "Daryl, here's the 20 cents for each can, so I wouldn't be out of pocket." I said, "Yep." I went up and they said, "Who are you?" "Bristow, 3 cans, tick, tick, tick." I said, "That's all right." And when you got back, 3 people were happy. That's what you do. Yeah, yeah. And because I did this, when I was out, I got first choice of the lollies. Has anybody told you anything about this? Right, after every 200 meal ration packs, you get a shipper full of cigarettes. I didn't go near those, because in each individual ration pack, you had one little tiny little packet of cigarettes for you. I couldn't even give the damn things away. So I ended up leaving in my pack. Every time I'd come back to Newey Dat, I'd put them in the locker. When I was sending, I won't get into trouble, will I? When I was sending, I bought a slide projector, and the packing for the slide projector around it was hundreds and hundreds, or customs are going to kill me, of little packets of American cigarettes, and Dad got them. Four days. You went down on the Thursday. Now, this gets a bit personal. The Australian Army decided when they send kids down, why they went them down was, I believe the girls were checked for certain diseases on a Thursday. And of course, we were home again by Monday sometime. And of course, if the girls had something that they shouldn't have, they were then sort of had to, I think they had some sort of pass that they had to hand in, that they weren't able to do their little bit of trade whilst they didn't have that card. But the Americans ignored that, and of course they suffered pretty badly, but penicillin seemed to sort the problem out for them. Every time we had to be resupplied with water, sometimes they brought it out in jerry cans. It didn't happen when I was with the 1st Reinforcement Unit. We took it from the river. We had 4 water bottles, and because I'm right-handed, I always drank from here, this side. So this one was ready to drink, that's almost ready to drink. The 2 that are attached to the backpack, 1st stage of purification, 2nd stage of purification. The first one kills the bacteria, the second one makes it respectable to drink. The only thing I remember about the water, if it's raining, the water's red. If it's not raining, the water's black. Right. But so when I got to the 3rd Battalion, working out of APCs, we had fresh water coming out. The helicopter landed every day at 3 o'clock. Now this is why I'm supportive of my 101-year-old mum. She wants to come home, and I said, look, come home, it's going to happen. But every Thursday, a cake arrived from Australia in a tin. As many people crowded around the tin as they could. Mum baked the cake on the Saturday, cooled it on the Sunday. Dad packed it late Sunday night. Plastic, Hessian was a top one. In those days, you know, you have blue trailer covers now. Mm-hmm. Dad got that sort of material, but it was white. And they sewed it all up. And when it arrived, 4 days after it was made, it always had green fungus on it. Don't ask me how, but we didn't care. So I just used my hat, because, you know, we haven't washed for 2 weeks. You'd wipe the fungus off the top. You would use your bayonet, trying to cut equal shares, because you had everybody looking over your shoulder. That piece is a bit bigger. Cut it. Mum and Dad and grandparents, not my brother, he only sent 1 letter, my sister sent 2. My grandparents, maternal and paternal, sent mail to me. Mum sent a letter every day. Dad sent, because, you know, they're married, he sent every 2 days, and I was the only person in the platoon to get, on average, a letter and a half every day, or was it 1 letter every day and a half, plus a cake. But also, because it was the football season, I received Friday's Sun, Saturday's Sporting Globe, and you don't hear that now, with the pink pages, I know it well. And Monday's Sun with the football results. But you still listen to the football, even though there's a time difference. We always stopped to listen to the football if we weren't moving, you know, on the APCs changing positions. Now, this is a bit funny here. We required the army toilet paper to write home on, unused of course, because Mum would have yelled. But after the paper was read, it was recycled back into the bush. But it's so funny, because it was from home, everybody took a double page. And you'd hear whispers, who's got page 7? Who's got page 8? Because you're reading an article and the damn thing goes on to the next page. So by the time everybody in a whole week read all the newspaper. It doesn't matter whether it's a lieutenant or the corporal or the people that were driving the APCs. Everybody read the paper to get any bit of information. The funniest thing I've ever saw was a bloke got a letter from Vic Rhodes. I don't know how he paid his registration from the jungle in Vietnam, but we all thought a funny side of it. But that's that. But no, Mum and Dad were behind me. Well, apart from Mum's activities, you know, but I never was short of mail, never short of newspaper. If I had to need the newspaper at certain times of the day, I always went out through the gun position, you know, with machine gun, because the gun people change, one changes every hour and the other changes on the 2 hours. So there's always one person just on, one person been on an hour. And I would say, I'm going out to that tree there if you see movement, because with the Viet Cong, when your greens are wet, they're black, they look black. And I was, this sounds stupid, I never went to the toilet on the top part of the hour, as in 12, 11. I always went on the bottom part of the hour because I knew you weren't having a new person coming on. And I never went to the toilet in the dark. I made sure I conditioned my body that if I had to do number twos, it was always in daylight, and it was always, you know, because people got killed through, not that I know, but you hear rumours. People get killed because they're going out to the toilet. And I have been on the gun duty for night time, and even though some people had tiny, tiny torches, the fireflies in Vietnam of a night time, it's like that, you know, oh, light, and then a few more paces, light again, and you're swinging the gun, the M60, or if you're on the 50 calibre, gee, I wish I'd fired the 50, but I never fired it because you don't want to give the position away. But they move. And the more you look at the trees start to move with your eyes, because your best vision is what comes out the side. What comes out the front is not good for night time. When I came back, we had to pay for the airplane fare. We marched through Adelaide, and we had been told things weren't good for the soldiers when they came back. You know, you're not to sort of be out in uniform, because there was a lot of ill feeling. And, you know, little things like people used to say, you're a baby killer. Well, I never saw a baby. I saw a monkey, if that counts, but I never saw a baby. Saw lots of snakes, humorous experiences with snakes. There's one, can I tell you about one? It doesn't make us look good. Yeah. Right, doesn't make me look good. Of a night time, we used to, you know, like the wagon wheels in the old westerns, the three mortars always had to be aligned for a fire mission, you know, the bearings. And all around us were these 8 armoured personnel carriers pointing out, with the communications one in the centre. So when we had to cook on our little hexamine stove, which is a little stove and a little bit of paraffin sort of tablet, and I'm sitting there, and out of the corner of my eye, it was a moonlight night, and there was something beside me that was moving, and the moon was reflecting off it. So I was all right, but it was my feet that were the problem. I have never seen so many cowardly actions from my feet. They took off. The first foot hit the track. The second foot was on top of the vehicle, and I followed it, screaming, snake, snake, snake. And every person that was on the ground was on the tracks, and torches everywhere. And it was a snake, because they had a snake in Vietnam. It was green, and I think green and yellow, a tiny little thing, crate or some name like that. They say if it bites you, you normally take 1 step or 2 steps and then you die. It's so venomous. I never gave it the benefit of the doubt. It was a snake. So I took off, but I was a bit concerned about my legs. I'm not blaming me. I was all right. It was the feet that took off. They were the cowardly ones. And I always remember a warrant officer told me, I don't know whether it's true or not, an American gunny sergeant, you know, with all this stuff here, he wanted a Land Rover, long wheelbase, for the regimental collection way back in Fort such and such in America, and he was prepared to give us a gunship. And the warrant officer said, look, someone signed for it. You know, how can you, what are you going to say what happened to your Land Rover? And what are you going to say, why have you now got a gunship? But the Americans, when they issue stuff, you know, it was so strange. Yeah. The RSL didn't want us. The Second World War veterans, not my father, nor my uncles, a lot of the RSLs, and that's why I never joined the RSL. Well, you think about it, I came back late 71, I joined the RSL, Mumbolk RSL in 96. They didn't accept us, we weren't good enough. The army, the regular soldiers called us chocos, we called them regs. And when you look at the casualty lists in Vietnam, we lost troops, but we were always trying to prove to the regular troops, so our NASTO blokes probably went that extra yard to prove, and it was sad, but we did that. But the thing that really turned me off Vietnam, and I can say this now, big time, in September, we were told the army was sending us out. And we're thinking, well, hang on, because when I was in Vung Tau, the girls told me, did you know you're leaving Australia in October on the exact day? The army hadn't told us, but the bloody girls in the bars told us. So if they knew, the Viet Cong knew. Anyway, next thing we know, we're going out one large exercise in September. And we're all thinking, well, hang on, we've all written home to say we're coming home. You know, the first or whatever, the first week in October. Why send us out the second last week, going into the last week, looking for trouble? I know we shouldn't say this, but that's what you think. Why are you sending us out? We're going home. Anyway, they sent us out. With the 3rd Battalion, it was like rings. You know, there's Nui Dat, the 3rd Battalion was there, the 4th Battalion was further out. We couldn't get in contact with each other because people had been killed in the 3rd Battalion. You should, if you want to meet up with somebody out there, you've got to ring up and say, I'm coming out from the west. Anyway, but we didn't bump into them at that stage, but I witnessed a battle from the 4th Battalion that it went on for hours and hours. We were mortars expecting, you know, we thought they might have come back through our way, so we were trying to fill up sandbags and fortify ourselves should the Viet Cong come back through us, and we wouldn't have lasted long if there'd been lots of them. But all day helicopter gunships, and you know they had, the Americans had them. You could always tell there were Hercules. There used to be C-47s that had lots of guns out the side, but these were Hercules that had lots of guns out the side. And you could always tell because when they circled around, it was like a straight line of tracer. And it was like 1 in 5 was tracer, so you can imagine how many rounds. This went on for ages. But when the helicopters went in, theirs was a straight line, but then the side gunners with the twin M60s, and they zigzagged across the sky towards the target. And we watched this from probably lunchtime till maybe 7 or 8 o'clock at night. And I believe, don't quote me, but I believe 4 people were killed. And I'm thinking to myself, those 4 people probably wrote home and said, we are coming home in November. And I thought, and I was really critical of the government and especially the military. It wasn't until 1983 I bought the Australians at War History. Here I am reading it. The Australians went out looking for trouble. They were worrying about the Viet Cong bringing mortars in within range of the field hospital at Nui Dat. Why in the hell didn't they tell us? Like when I was 10 years in reserves, and it took a long time from 1971 to when I joined the reserves in 1989, and I spent 2 years as a volunteer photographer from 87 to 89. Why? And they always said, we're doing this because of that, but they didn't think enough of our national servicemen to say, we're going to go out because we're worrying about the Viet Cong now that they know that you're leaving, will bring their mortars in closer and take out the hospital. It was so easy. And then from then on I thought, you stupid buggers, if we had known that, and I'm sure the 4 people that had died, if they'd known that, it would have been, they would have felt better, you know? Because in 1970, as Mum was concerned, you know, we lost 1,034 on the roads in Victoria. And that's when they brought in safety belts, or just after. And we lost 520 or whatever. But I always remember 1 week in Vietnam, the Americans, because we used to listen to Radio America, they were that excited they only lost 129 in 1 week. It's their all-record low, and us soldiers are looking at each other thinking, bloody hell, they're bragging about losing 129. What were they losing the other weeks? Another thing that I remember, which is true, when we were told we were coming home, we got on Caribou aircraft at Nui Dat. They flew us down to Vung Tau. The battalion, what was it, 800, 900 men, on the airfield, and they were shunted out in a shuttle service out to the Sydney that was out there. Your baggage, so normally they would hold, I think, 9 people. I don't think there was, I think someone even sat next to the side gunner, on the door gunners, you know, either side, and 5 across the seat and someone sitting on the floor closest to the pilot and the co-pilot. But I sat there, support company, there was a raffle. Support company lost, which meant they went on first, which meant they were down in the boat. I sat there for about 2 hours as they called the names out. It got down to 2 people, and guess who were the 2 people was? Me, stupid. Then they called out the other person's name, and I thought, oh my God, what's Mum going to say if I don't get on the boat? And he said, who are you? I said, Bristow, sir. Get on the bloody helicopter. Someone was looking after me, because when I got on last on the boat. Well, hang on, it wasn't last. I ran like hell when he said get on. I passed the people, the names had been called to make sure I was on the helicopter. I don't know if you've ever been on an aircraft carrier, but you've got the flight deck, the hangar deck. Adjacent to the hangar deck, but on the outside, but not over the ocean, there are little compartments. So I was in one of those little compartments in a hammock. It didn't matter which way the ship was going, I was always level. If the ship was doing this, and believe me, the ship did that as well as that, I was always level. The disadvantages were I couldn't put the hammock up until 8 o'clock at night. To amuse ourselves for the 10-day voyage, I did one duty. I cleaned the petty officers' showers, 10 soldiers, 1 mop, 1 bucket. So I think I touched the mop once, and then after that it's done, and we went back and watched the movies. And there was a very suggestive movie, Marlon Brando, Last Tango in Paris or something, you know? And of course the Army, the Navy projectionist made sure that we saw everything we needed to see multiple times. Stop, reverse, stop and play, you know? And each time we got the same result. Oh! We were then told, your kit will be inspected before you arrive in Port Adelaide. I had smuggled back, because I had a friend who loved ammunition, I had smuggled back the complete set of 50 calibre bullets, but no powder, and just the projectiles in the powder. No powder, just the cases. I when I was carrying the M16, there was a detachable bipod. You sort of squeeze it over the barrel and then you put it down again. A lot of boys brought back magazines that weren't appropriate at the time in Australia. I also brought back 2 tiny smoke grenades. After the person got lost, there was a person that got lost for 2 days. He was so frightened he didn't yell out when the helicopter kept looking for him. They had, you know, the old 35mm cartridges that the old film used to go into, the screw top little metal ones? Well, they had these personal smoke grenades that it only goes for 5 seconds or 10 seconds. It's only the same size as the cartridge. And when I came back with my camera around my neck, I could get into trouble smuggling in something now. I had, in the 2 little pouches, I had these smoke grenades and everybody just thought they were film. But I brought those back and I was able to give those to my mate. And when he passed away, when they went through the house, it went to the Olinda or Sassafras RSL. But I managed to bring that. But when we were told that everything was going to be checked, the 1,200 soldiers went to the deck, and I'm sure the ship was light and no end. So in the middle of ocean is a complete set of 50 calibre bullets, 1 detachable M16 bipod, and numerous magazines floating on the water. I landed at a place called Tullamarine and I'm thinking, am I on the moon? When I left to go to Vietnam, to go back to Sydney, I flew out through Essendon. Tullamarine's, now you go out there now, it's nothing like it was 50 years ago. There's nothing there. An airfield, a big airfield. And I landed at Tullamarine and thought, my God, where am I? Mum and Dad were waiting for me at the airport. Mum wasn't going to take any chances with the army stuffing up transport to get me back to Melbourne. Mum and Dad was there. Mum, she played in the dance band. She played the piano. So what they did is, it's just a coincidence, Mum was out at North Melbourne with her little band playing, she used to play old time, you know, Second World War music and the dance music. Dad, I was immediately picked up, dropped off at my auntie at North Melbourne. Knew nothing about what was going on, didn't know who had babies or anything. I'm getting there thinking, oh yeah. So then after the dance, Mum and Dad picked me up, brought me back to Callista, because I was living at home. Whilst I was away, my sister got married, but there was nothing I could do about it. I knew it was happening. And the sad thing is, when I got at the airport, the first thing I said to my mum, Grampy, her father, I said, how's Grampy? Because the last letter I had in Vietnam, my sister had got married in September. He was all right for the wedding. He died on the 10-day trip back to Melbourne from Vung Tau, you know, Vung Tau to the boat. And then by the time it came back to Melbourne, he was dead and buried. So I didn't even get the chance to see him. When I left, he was well. When I came back, he was gone.